Three tiny German Shepherd puppies, shivering beside their mother, tied to a wooden post in the middle of a blizzard. Her eyes, tired, frozen, but still begging the wind for mercy. No one was coming, until a lone truck appeared through the snow, driven by a Navy SEAL who had already lost too much. He wasn't searching for redemption, but sometimes redemption finds you. When he saw that mother dog trying to shield her babies from the storm, he stopped. And that single choice would change 4 lives, and his own, forever. Because sometimes, God hides miracles in the places we almost drive past. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments below. The wind moved like a restless animal over the white ridges of Vermont, pushing endless waves of snow across the road. Pine trees bent and groaned under their frozen weight, their shadows long and trembling under the faint orange glow of Ethan Cole's truck headlights. The world was colorless. Sky, land, and air all merged into a single sheet of cold silence. It was the kind of night where even God seemed to whisper more softly. Ethan Cole, 38, gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his knuckles pale against the cracked leather. His uniform, the soft green, gray, brown camouflage of the Navy working uniform Type 3, still carried the faint scent of salt and metal, though it had been months since he'd last seen the ocean. His dark brown hair, trimmed short with a streak of gray near the temples, framed a face hardened by time and loss. A light beard shadowed his jawline, emphasizing the deep lines around his mouth. The kind of lines that come from both laughter, long forgotten, and nights spent awake in silence. His steel blue eyes, usually focused and sharp, now seemed unfixed, as if they were searching for something out in the storm that wasn't really there. He wasn't driving to any destination. He just drove. That was what he'd done ever since he left the Navy, ever since the world had stopped making sense. The war had ended for everyone else. Medals handed out, speeches made, but inside him, it was still snowing. He'd lost brothers out there, and in some quiet, unreachable place, he blamed himself. As he turned a bend, his headlights caught something that made him ease off the gas. At first, it looked like debris against the fence, a bundle of movement pressed against the wood. Then he saw the flicker of eyes, not human, low, wide, desperate. He stopped the truck and turned off the engine. The sound of the wind filled everything. He opened the door, and the storm rushed in, biting at his skin. Snow stung his face as he walked toward the fence. There, tied with a coarse rope, was a German Shepherd mother, her fur stiff with ice and patches of snow clinging to her back. She was thin, too thin, her ribs visible beneath her coat, but her eyes burned with fierce awareness. She was trembling, but she stood over a small pile of life beneath her belly. 3 tiny puppies, maybe 2 weeks old, their fur still soft and patchy. Their breathing shallow. Little bodies huddled against one another for warmth. Ethan's breath caught in his chest. He'd seen pain before, on the faces of men, in the silence after gunfire. But there was something pure and unbearable about the way this mother stood, refusing to lie down, even as the cold was eating through her. "Hey, easy," he whispered, voice barely audible over the wind. "It's okay, girl." He crouched slowly, extending a gloved hand. The dog's ears twitched, her body tensed, but she didn't growl. Her eyes followed his hand, not with trust, but with the last thread of hope. Ethan reached for his pocket knife and carefully cut the rope that held her. The moment the rope snapped, she stumbled forward, not to run, but to press her body against her pups again. He could feel the tremor in her limbs, as if her heart were shaking the ground beneath them. Without thinking, he unzipped his heavy navy coat and slipped the 3 puppies inside, cradling them against his chest. Their tiny hearts beat weakly against the fabric, their breath fogging his uniform. "You're all right now," he murmured, though part of him wasn't sure who he was talking to. The mother watched, uncertain, her muzzle covered in frost. Ethan took off his gloves, ignoring the sting of the air, and reached out. She sniffed his hand once, then lowered her head as if surrendering. That small act broke something inside him. He scooped her up, feeling her weight, far too light for her size, and carried her toward the truck. Inside, warmth began to build again as the engine rumbled. He placed the puppies gently on the passenger seat, wrapping them with his coat, while the mother curled beside them. She let out a low sigh, her eyes closing halfway. Ethan looked at the frost melting from her fur and whispered, "You're safe, Mama." Outside, the snow kept falling, thick and endless, covering the road that had led him here. He leaned back in the seat, breath fogging the glass, and stared at the small family beside him. He didn't know who had left them there or why. All he knew was that he had found something fragile and alive, something that demanded he stay human. For a long time, he sat still, listening to the rhythm of their breathing. The puppies moved faintly, little sounds of life filling the silence that had once belonged to ghosts. His chest ached, not from cold, but from memory. Of soldiers he couldn't save, of nights spent under desert skies, wishing for redemption. Maybe this was it, he thought. Maybe this was the first thing he could save that wouldn't disappear. As the storm began to thicken again, he started the truck, headlights cutting a narrow path through the white. In the rearview mirror, the German shepherd's eyes glowed in the dim light, full of something he hadn't seen in a long time. Gratitude. It struck him how easily love could return, even in broken creatures. Meanwhile, miles away across the frozen valley, Henry and Martha Brooks sat in their wooden farmhouse, the only house with light still burning in the storm. Henry, a man in his 70s, with a wiry frame and weathered face, sat near the radio, his old army jacket still draped over the chair. His hair was silver, cut short, his eyes a calm hazel that had once seen too much war. He listened to the static of the broadcast, warning about the blizzard, and muttered, "It'll be a rough one tonight." Beside him, Martha, a small woman with soft white hair tied in a loose bun, looked up from her knitting. Her face carried kindness the way snow carried light, gentle, natural, unspoken. "Henry," she said, her voice calm and a little sad, "I hope no one's out there tonight. Not in this." He looked at her and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who knew how little he could control in the world. "If someone is," he replied, "I pray the Lord sends them a reason to keep going." Back on the road, Ethan drove slowly through the curtain of snow. His headlights illuminated the swirling flakes, making them look like 1,000 spirits rising. The mother dog lifted her head, resting it on his armrest, her warm breath clouding the cold air. Her eyes met his, and he felt something quiet stir inside him. The same thing he'd once felt when his squad made it home after a firefight. A fragile sense of survival, undeserved, but real. When the truck finally reached a clearing, Ethan stopped. The snow was falling harder now, almost erasing the world around him. He looked once more at the family beside him, the mother, the 3 pups sleeping against each other, and then at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. His eyes looked different, as if the storm had washed something away. He exhaled, long and slow, then whispered, "Let's go home." The truck's tires rolled forward, leaving shallow tracks that the snow quickly swallowed. Behind him, the fence where he'd found them vanished into white. Ahead, the road curved toward the valley, where, by the light of a distant farmhouse, 2 old souls prayed for strangers they would soon meet. And in that moment, surrounded by ice and silence, a journey of 8 hearts began. One born not of duty, but of grace. The storm had not quieted by morning, but it had grown tired. Snow still drifted from the sky in lazy spirals, soft and relentless, blanketing the forest in silence. Ethan Cole guided his truck through the narrow path that led to the cabin, the old tires crunching over frozen gravel. The headlights carved a pale tunnel of light through the swirling air. Every few seconds, he looked toward the passenger seat where the German Shepherd mother, whom he had silently named Grace, lay curled with her 3 puppies. The smallest one trembled faintly, its breath shallow but steady. Grace's golden brown eyes followed every movement he made, her body pressed protectively against her pups. When the cabin came into view, a weathered wooden structure half buried in snow, Ethan felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not nostalgia, not exactly peace, but a small recognition of what used to be home. The porch steps creaked beneath his boots as he carried the mother and pups inside. The air was frigid and stale, the scent of damp wood and dust lingering like a memory of years gone by. He remembered helping his father chop wood outside that same door, the echo of laughter before life became too heavy for laughter to exist. Inside, he moved instinctively, as if muscle memory had carried him back to survival mode. He gathered firewood from the storage corner, cleared out the ashes from the old stone fireplace, and struck a match. The flame caught quickly, rising and snapping, filling the room with orange light and the faint scent of burning pine. Ethan took off his jacket, wrapped it around the puppies, and placed Grace closer to the fire. She hesitated at first, ears twitching, then lowered her head, finally allowing her muscles to relax. He sat on the wooden floor, stretching his tired legs, and watched the light flicker across their fur. One of the puppies let out a small whimper, nudging closer to its siblings. Ethan smiled, a faint, almost forgotten expression. "You're safe now," he murmured, voice rough with exhaustion. Then leaning back against the wall, he whispered more softly, "From now on, we're not alone." The words escaped before he could stop them. They sounded strange in the quiet, too honest, too human. As the fire grew stronger, the frost began to melt from the window panes. Shadows danced on the cabin walls. Ethan could almost hear his father's voice again, deep, patient, full of the steady calm that had once kept this place alive. His father, Daniel Cole, had been a man of few words, a logger with calloused hands and a heart too big for his own good. He had died years ago from a heart attack while helping a neighbor repair a roof during a snowstorm. Ethan had been overseas then, unable to return in time. That guilt had never left him. Tonight, though, sitting in the same cabin his father built, he felt as if the old man was there again, silent, forgiving. Grace lifted her head and looked at him, eyes glimmering in the firelight. For a second, Ethan imagined she understood everything. His weariness, his need for redemption. He reached out and scratched behind her ears. "You're tougher than most soldiers I've met," he said with a low laugh. Her tail gave a faint thump against the floor, and the warmth in the room deepened. Across the valley, inside a farmhouse wrapped in snow, Martha Brooks was washing dishes when she caught sight of a faint glow through the window. The light was faint, flickering near the edge of the woods. Her gray eyes, soft but sharp from years of watching storms roll through these hills, narrowed slightly. "Henry," she called, "look at that. There's a fire down by the coal cabin." Henry Brooks, tall but slightly stooped from age, joined her at the window. His face was lined with the kind of wrinkles that told stories more than years. He scratched the side of his silver beard and squinted into the distance. "That old place hasn't seen light since Daniel passed," he said quietly. His voice carried the gravel of old battlefields, the kind that never left a man, even decades later. He put a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe his boys come back." Martha nodded slowly. She had met Ethan once as a child. A polite boy who always held doors open and carried his father's lunchbox on weekends. "If it's him," she said softly, "I hope he's not alone." Henry smiled faintly, the corner of his mouth lifting. "If he's back, maybe he's finally found a reason to be." Then he turned the radio down, which was muttering about road closures, and added, "Tomorrow I'll check in, just to make sure the chimney's still drawing smoke." Back in the cabin, Ethan rummaged through the few things still left behind. A cracked ceramic mug, a stack of old newspapers, and an old photograph resting under a film of dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve. It showed his father standing in front of the cabin, one arm around a boy no older than 10. Both wore the same plaid flannel coats, both smiling like the world was simple. He held the picture for a long time, his throat tightening. He placed it back on the mantel, beside the fire, where the light could touch it again. Grace stirred suddenly, lifting her head. Her ears perked toward the door. Outside, something moved. Maybe the groan of wind or the crack of a branch. Ethan's instinct sharpened. Years of combat never left a man's body completely. The muscles still remembered. He stood, moving silently to the window. Nothing but the blizzard stared back. "Still," he whispered, "easy, girl, just the wind." He returned to the fire, breaking a piece of bread from his small ration pack and tossing a few crumbs toward Grace. She sniffed it, then ate, tail wagging once. Her puppies, now warmer, shifted against each other, small sounds filling the silence. As the hours passed, fatigue crept over him like another layer of snow. He sat near the fire, head resting on his knees, eyes half closed. The storm outside faded to a soft hiss, and inside, the world shrank to the crackling of firewood and the slow breathing of 4 living souls. By the time dawn pressed faint light through the window, Ethan stirred. Grace was asleep, her pups tucked tightly against her belly. The fire had dimmed, but still glowed faintly. He stood, stretching, feeling the ache of his muscles, but also a strange comfort, a sense that, for once, his fight had led him somewhere meaningful. He stepped outside. The air was sharp, but the storm had finally passed. Snow stretched endlessly in all directions, glittering under the rising sun. The world was clean again, washed by the storm. Behind him, through the cabin window, the fire still burned. Miles away, in their farmhouse, Henry poured 2 mugs of coffee. "He's made it through the night," he said to Martha, glancing at the faint line of smoke rising from the trees. Martha smiled, her voice soft. Then maybe that cabin will be a home again. Back in the clearing, Ethan looked toward the sky, exhaled a long breath that turned into mist, and whispered, "We survived." The words hung in the cold morning air like a quiet promise. The snow hadn't stopped falling in the distance, but inside that small cabin, the fire had begun to burn again, and with it, the first warmth of hope. The storm had passed, but the world remained quiet, wrapped in layers of soft white fog. The trees stood frozen in stillness, their branches heavy with snow, and the air shimmered faintly with the light of a pale winter sun. The road that led toward the coal cabin curved through a corridor of frost-laden pines. Henry Brooks trudged through it with slow, deliberate steps, his breath fogging in the morning air. He was 72, tall, but slightly bent from years of labor and old wounds that still ached whenever the temperature dropped. His weathered face bore the kind of strength that comes only from endurance. Deep creases around his mouth and eyes that had once seen more than they could tell. Beneath his wool hat, strands of silver hair escaped in uneven curls. He carried a bundle of dry firewood under one arm and a small basket of bread wrapped in cloth under the other. The walk to the cabin wasn't long, but it brought back memories that made the distance feel heavier. He had helped Ethan's father, Daniel Cole, build that very porch almost 40 years ago. They had been young men then. Henry freshly returned from Vietnam, Daniel from the logging mills, both trying to make sense of the silence that followed hardship. Daniel had been the kind of man who spoke little and listened well. When he died, something in Henry had gone quiet too. Now, seeing a faint wisp of smoke curling from the cabin chimney, Henry felt a strange flutter of hope. He reached the door, knocked twice, and stepped back. The sound of movement came from inside, soft, cautious. The door creaked open. Ethan Cole stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, his face half-shadowed by the light from the fire behind him. His uniform sleeves were rolled up, showing veins and scars across his forearms. There was a roughness in his appearance, the faint beard, the fatigue in his eyes, but also a quiet discipline that hadn't left him since his days as a Navy SEAL. For a moment, the two men simply looked at each other through the breath of cold air between them. Henry spoke first, his voice rough but kind. "You look just like him," he said. Ethan frowned slightly. "You knew my father?" "Knew him well enough to know you got his stubborn jaw," Henry said with a small grin, stepping forward. "I'm Henry Brooks. Daniel and I served different wars, same fight, keeping good men alive." Ethan hesitated, then stepped aside, gesturing toward the fire. "Come in. It's cold." Inside, the warmth of the cabin seemed almost alive. The fire burned steady, casting golden light across the old wooden walls. On the floor near the hearth, the German shepherd, Grace, lay curled protectively around her 3 puppies. Their soft fur gleamed like copper against the orange glow. One of them stirred, pawing clumsily at its mother's tail. Henry's eyes softened immediately. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "Didn't think I'd see a sight like that again." He knelt slowly, his knees cracking audibly, and extended a hand toward Grace. The mother dog sniffed once, and then allowed his touch. "Smart eyes," Henry said. "She trusts you." Ethan poured him a cup of coffee, the strong, bitter kind that tasted like black earth in long nights. They sat by the fire, 2 soldiers of different generations sharing warmth and silence. For a while, only the crackling wood and the faint squeaks of the puppies filled the air. Henry finally spoke. "Your father used to bring you up here in the summers. You were just a kid with a slingshot and too many questions. He was proud of you, you know." Ethan stared into the fire, the light reflecting off his pale eyes. "He died while I was deployed. I didn't make it back for the funeral." Henry nodded slowly. "War takes more than it gives. Always has." Ethan's jaw tightened. "It took my team too. Afghanistan, 3 years ago. We were clearing a village when the ground went up under us. I made it out. They didn't." His voice faltered, and he rubbed a hand over his beard as though trying to wipe the memory away. "Since then, I keep driving. Nowhere to go. Just away from the ghosts." Henry leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You ever think maybe God doesn't ask us to forget them? Maybe he just asks us to keep moving so they can rest?" Ethan glanced at him, surprised by the gentleness in the older man's tone. "You talk like someone who's seen it too." Henry gave a weary smile. 1972. Quang Tree. I was clearing a jungle path when my boot hit something that clicked. Didn't have time to move. The dog beside me, German Shepherd, name was Bandit, lunged forward and knocked me flat. The blast took him instead of me. After that, I figured God keeps sending dogs to remind us what loyalty looks like. He looked toward Grace. "Guess he's still sending them." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "Maybe he's sending them to both of us." As if on cue, Grace lifted her head and let out a soft, contented sigh. The puppies stirred again, tumbling over each other, tiny paws sliding on the wooden floor. Outside, the fog had begun to thin, but the world was still bathed in pale silver light. From the doorway came another sound, a gentle knock. Ethan stood and opened it to find Martha Brooks standing there, wrapped in a thick brown coat with a knitted scarf of faded rose color around her neck. Her white hair was pinned neatly, though a few strands had escaped and glowed like threads of light in the mist. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her gray eyes warm and steady. In her hands, she carried a small basket covered with a linen cloth. "I brought you something," she said, with a smile that felt like sunlight after long rain. Henry forgot it, as usual. "Forgot what?" Henry asked from the fire. "Breakfast," she said, setting the basket on the table. He never remembers food when there's something interesting to see. She glanced toward the floor and gasped softly. "Oh, Henry, look at them." The puppies were now clumsily following Grace around the hearth, their small bodies bumping into furniture and slipping on the rug. Martha knelt, laughter spilling from her like music. "They make this house breathe again." Ethan couldn't help but smile. "They're trouble already." "Good trouble," Martha said, brushing her fingers through one puppy's soft fur. "Every home needs it." The three of them shared a simple meal: bread, honey, and the quiet comfort of shared company. The old clock on the wall ticked steadily, a heartbeat returning to a house that had been empty too long. When Henry and Martha finally rose to leave, Henry paused at the door, turning back to look at Ethan. The mist outside had lifted enough for sunlight to spill through, pale and gold. "Son," Henry said, voice low and sure, "maybe you didn't just save them. Maybe they were sent to save you, and maybe us too." Ethan met his gaze, and for the first time in years, nodded with something that almost resembled peace. Grace barked softly, as if agreeing. As the old couple disappeared down the snowy path, Ethan stood by the window, watching the light climb over the trees. The warmth in his chest felt fragile, but alive. For the first time in a long while, he let it stay. The sun never really rose that morning. It only glowed faintly behind a wall of gray clouds that hovered low over the valley. Snow hung from the pine branches like white ghosts, and the wind scraped softly across the frozen ground. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to glowing coals, and Ethan Cole sat beside it, rubbing warmth into his hands, before glancing at Grace, the German shepherd mother, who lay stretched near the hearth. Her fur caught the dim light, the black and tan blending into soft shadows. But one look told him something was wrong. She was licking her right hind leg repeatedly, and when she tried to stand, she winced. The way she lifted the paw slightly off the ground made Ethan's gut tighten. He moved closer, crouching beside her. "Hey, easy, girl," he murmured. He examined her leg, noticing the thin, crusted line hidden under the fur. A deep rope burn, red and raw from days of friction and cold. He remembered the thick wire that had held her tied to the fence. "Damn," he whispered, his voice full of guilt. "You've been hurting all along, haven't you?" Grace's eyes met his, calm but tired. She gave a low whine, and Ethan felt that strange weight in his chest again, the one that always came when he realized how fragile life could be. He wrapped a bandage loosely from the first aid kit he kept in his truck, but he knew it wasn't enough. She needed more than he could give. He pulled on his coat and grabbed the truck keys. "Hang tight, girl. We're getting that looked at." Grace tilted her head as if she understood. The three puppies, now stronger and chubbier, blinked sleepily from the basket near the fire, their tiny noses twitching. Ethan scooped them up into a blanket, tucked them under his arm, and opened the door. The cold air rushed in like a knife. Outside, the road was half buried in snow, the kind that looked soft, but hid sheets of ice underneath. Ethan carried the puppies to the truck, helped Grace climb inside, and started the engine. The heater groaned to life as he steered carefully toward town. The road curved through the white forest like a path drawn by faith more than reason. Grace sat upright despite her limp, keeping her eyes on the window, watching the snow blur by. There was something noble about her, that quiet, uncomplaining endurance that only mothers seem to possess. Ethan stole a glance at her and said softly, "You're tougher than any soldier I've known." At the edge of the small town, the lights of a red-bricked building came into view. Green Hollow Veterinary Clinic. The sign was half covered in snow, and the small parking lot was empty except for a single old blue pickup. Ethan parked and carried the puppies inside, Grace limping beside him. A brass bell chimed over the door as they entered. Behind the counter stood Dr. Lillian Hart, a woman in her early 40s with sandy blonde hair tied back in a messy bun. She wore a green sweater under a white lab coat and had the kind of calm, kind eyes that could quiet even frightened animals. Her hands were small, but steady, her movements precise. There were faint, dark circles under her eyes, signs of long nights and too many emergencies. "Oh my goodness," she said, stepping forward as soon as she saw Grace. "What happened to her?" "Found her tied up in the storm a few nights ago," Ethan said. His voice carried that gravelly calm that came from years of command, though it softened when he spoke to her. "She's been limping since then. Looks like an infected burn." Dr. Hart knelt, her voice gentle. "Hey, sweetheart," she whispered to Grace. The dog sniffed her hand cautiously before relaxing, as though sensing the kindness there. "You did the right thing bringing her in," Lillian said. "Let's take a look." Ethan stayed by Grace's side as the doctor cleaned the wound. The antiseptic stung. Grace flinched but didn't pull away. Ethan's hand rested on her neck, steadying her, his thumb brushing the fur between her ears. The small moment felt sacred, as though some unseen thread connected them through pain and trust. While Lillian worked, she asked, "You from around here? Don't think I've seen you before." Ethan hesitated. "Used to be. Grew up in the valley. Been away. A long time." Her eyes flicked to the dog tags faintly visible under his collar. "Military?" "Navy," he said simply. "Retired now." She gave a slow nod. "You look like someone who's carried too much weight for too long." He almost smiled. "You're not wrong." When she finished, she wrapped Grace's leg carefully. "She'll be fine," Lillian said. "Clean wound, strong heart. You'll need to change the dressing daily and keep her off that leg for a bit." "I'll make sure she does," Ethan replied. Lillian looked toward the puppies, nestled in the blanket on the counter, and smiled. "And these must be her babies. They look good, strong. You must be doing something right." "Mostly her," Ethan said, glancing at Grace. "I just keep the fire going." Outside, the snow began to fall again, heavier than before. Ethan thanked Lillian, offered to pay, but she shook her head. "You can bring me coffee next time," she said, smiling faintly. "That's enough." On the way back, visibility dropped fast. The wind picked up, and the road turned slippery. Halfway through the forest road, the truck's tires spun on ice, sliding sideways until they hit a snowbank. The vehicle lurched to a stop with a jolt that threw Ethan forward. The engine sputtered, then died. He cursed softly, trying to restart it, but the battery gave only a dull click. The storm was thickening fast, fine white needles dancing in the headlights. He turned to Grace. "We're walking," he said. She gave a low bark, almost as if to say she was ready. Ethan tucked the puppies into his jacket and stepped out into the snow, the wind clawing at his face. The world beyond the headlights was a blur of white and gray. Grace limped beside him, her breath forming small clouds in the air. Each step left deep prints in the snow, one large, 3 small, and 1 limping. The walk was slow, exhausting. Ethan's legs burned from the cold, but he didn't dare stop. Grace stumbled once, then stood again, eyes locked forward. Watching her struggle, yet refuse to give in, stirred something deep inside him. A reflection of the same stubborn will that had kept him alive in places far worse than this. When they finally reached the edge of the cabin clearing, Ethan's shoulders were numb, but his heart felt strangely light. He pushed open the cabin door with his elbow and staggered inside. Warmth greeted them from the faint embers still glowing in the fireplace. He laid the puppies by the fire and helped Grace lie down on the rug. Her breathing was fast, her flank rising and falling in the dim light. Ethan crouched beside her, pressing a hand to her fur. "You saved them out there," he said quietly. "You always do." Grace looked up at him, tail giving a slow wag. He added, his voice lower, more to himself than to her. "You saved me too." He poured water into a bowl, added a few pieces of bread, and watched her eat. Then he leaned back against the wall, the fatigue settling deep into his bones. Outside, the wind howled against the wooden walls, but inside, the fire began to grow again. The room smelled of smoke, wet fur, and life. The three things that reminded him he wasn't alone anymore. Across the valley, in their farmhouse, Martha Brooks stood by the window, hands clasped tightly. "They should have been back by now," she said. Henry, fixing a broken window latch, looked up and smiled faintly. "Ethan's a soldier. He knows how to come home in a storm." But as he glanced toward the forest, his eyes betrayed the worry that words couldn't hide. Martha bowed her head and whispered a prayer. Back at the cabin, Ethan reached out, brushing a hand over Grace's bandaged leg. "You saved them. I saved you. Guess we owe each other one," he murmured. Grace rested her head on his knee, eyes closing. The fire flickered. The wind eased, and for the first time since the storm began, the cabin felt like a sanctuary again. The days after the storm brought a rare stillness to the valley. The air was cold, sharp enough to bite through fabric, but the sunlight returned, reflecting off the snow like scattered diamonds. Smoke rose steadily from the chimney of the old coal cabin, curling into the clear sky, a quiet sign that life had taken root again. Inside, the faint sound of hammering echoed through the walls. Ethan Cole stood on the porch roof, wearing a thick flannel jacket with the sleeves rolled up, nails clenched between his teeth. His hands were red from the cold, but he barely noticed. Sweat mixed with sawdust on his brow as he hammered a new plank into place. Beside him, Henry Brooks, sturdy despite his 72 years, steadied the ladder below. Henry's frame was lean but wiry, the strength of a man who had spent a lifetime building and mending. His face, half hidden under a wool cap, bore the rough lines of both labor and laughter. When he glanced up at Ethan, his smile creased deep around his eyes. "You know, boy, most people your age hire someone to do this." Ethan grinned faintly. "Most people my age didn't spend 10 years patching roofs in Kandahar with duct tape and prayers." Henry chuckled, his breath misting in the air. "Fair enough. Just don't fall. Martha will kill me before the fall does." The cabin had begun to transform. The roof, once sagging and weather-stained, now gleamed with new pine boards. Inside, the walls were patched with fresh timber, the smell of sawdust mingling with wood smoke. Near the fireplace, Grace lay on a soft blanket, her leg nearly healed, watching her 3 puppies wrestle with a piece of cloth. Her eyes followed Ethan wherever he moved, as if silently guarding him. Every afternoon, the sound of an old truck announced the arrival of Martha Brooks. She always came bundled in a long brown coat, her white hair tucked into a knitted hat. Her cheeks glowed pink from the cold, and her hands were never empty. Today, she carried a metal pot wrapped in cloth, steam seeping from its edges. "Don't you 2 men freeze yourselves to death before lunch?" she said, her voice cheerful but commanding. Ethan climbed down from the roof as Martha set the pot on the table. The rich smell of soup filled the cabin, chicken and barley, seasoned with thyme and the kind of care that could only come from someone who still believed food could heal. "Smells like heaven," Ethan said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Don't flatter me," Martha replied, ladling soup into 3 mismatched bowls. "You're too thin to insult a cook. Sit down." Henry muttered playfully, "She's been bossing me around for 50 years. You might as well get used to it." They ate together by the fire, the bowls steaming in their hands. The radio on the mantel played softly, an old country station that crackled between songs. Between spoonfuls, Martha talked about the people in town, how the snowplow broke again, how the baker's son was leaving for college, how winter weddings always made her cry. Her stories flowed like gentle rivers, touching small corners of a quiet life. For Ethan, who had lived in deserts and darkness for so long, the sound of their voices and the scent of soup felt almost unreal. He glanced at Henry and Martha, their hands sometimes brushing, their laughter easy and full of years, and felt an ache that wasn't pain, but longing. He had fought in wars that tore families apart. Now, in a small wooden cabin in Vermont, he was witnessing how love built them back together. When lunch was done, Martha stood to clean the dishes, ignoring Ethan's protests. "You fix roofs, I fix messes," she said firmly. Outside, Grace barked once, a soft, throaty sound, as one of the puppies tried to climb the small wooden ramp Ethan had built for them. Henry stepped to the door, his grin wide. "Looks like your little soldiers are learning to march." But the joy dimmed later that night. As the sun dipped below the ridge, the smallest of the three puppies, the one with a white patch on its chest, began to wheeze faintly. Its breaths came shallow and uneven. Ethan noticed first. He picked the pup up gently, feeling its warmth fading. "He's cold," he said quietly. Martha, who had stayed to help patch the last of the kitchen floorboards, knelt beside him. She placed a soft hand on the puppy's tiny head, her fingers trembling. "It's just a chill," she said, though her voice faltered. Ethan wrapped the pup in a flannel cloth and held it near the fire. Grace whined softly, nudging her nose against her baby. Martha brewed a small pot of warm milk on the stove, pouring a bit into a spoon. Together, they worked through the night, Ethan feeding tiny drops, Martha whispering prayers under her breath. Henry dozed in the chair for a while, but even in sleep, his hand rested on Martha's shoulder. The cabin was dim except for the flicker of the firelight dancing across their faces. Time lost meaning. Each breath the puppy took felt like a fragile thread that might break at any moment. Ethan stared at the small creature in his palms, so helpless, yet so stubbornly alive. He remembered carrying wounded men in his arms under the burning Afghan sun, whispering words he didn't believe himself. Now, in this quiet cabin, he found himself whispering again, not to God, but to life itself. "Don't give up, not yet." Near dawn, a thin ray of gold slipped through the frosted window. The fire had burned low. Ethan's eyes were heavy, but he hadn't moved. Martha, sitting beside him, was half asleep, with her head resting on Henry's coat draped over the chair. Grace stirred and crawled closer, pressing her nose against the small bundle in Ethan's hands. For a moment, there was no sound. Then suddenly, a soft, faint whimper broke the silence. The puppy moved. Its tiny chest rose and fell. Martha gasped, tears filling her tired eyes. "Oh, thank the Lord," she whispered, covering her mouth. "That's a little winter miracle." Ethan smiled faintly, the first true smile he'd shown in weeks. Grace wagged her tail weakly, licking the puppy's ear. Henry woke at the sound, blinking through the morning light. "He made it?" Ethan nodded. "He made it." Henry leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long breath that sounded like gratitude itself. "Well," he said, "looks like we're winning wars we didn't even know we were fighting." Ethan looked at him, his eyes tired but bright. "What do you mean?" Henry smiled. "I mean, victory doesn't always come with medals, son. Sometimes it comes with a heartbeat that refuses to stop." The words lingered in the warm air as the puppy nestled back beside its mother and siblings. Outside, the valley glowed under the rising sun. The world, for once, was still. Inside the cabin, a family, broken, patched together, but whole in spirit, sat quietly as the fire burned on. The wind came first, long before the snow started to fall again. It whistled through the trees like a restless spirit, curling around the cabin and rattling the windows with each gust. Inside, Ethan Cole sat at the table, a lantern burning low beside him. The day's repairs were done, the tools neatly stacked by the wall, and Grace lay sleeping with her 3 puppies nestled close. The radio murmured faintly from the shelf, the announcer warning of another heavy storm moving through the valley. Ethan turned the dial down and leaned back in his chair, listening to the silence beyond the glass. It had been weeks since he first found the dogs, and the cabin, once dead and hollow, now pulsed with quiet life. The air smelled of pine, soup, and smoke. Yet that night, an unease settled in his chest, a premonition too vague to name. He rose to check the fire and noticed the heat wasn't spreading evenly. A dull, metallic thud sounded behind the wall, followed by a hiss, faint but distinct. His instincts sharpened instantly, the way they had on long patrols overseas when something unseen shifted in the air. He knelt by the old heating pipe near the back wall. The cabin system was ancient, patched together from his father's days. As he touched the iron joint, it vibrated under his palm, and then came a sharp crack like a gunshot. Steam burst out in a white cloud, followed by a roar. Ethan jumped back, but the next second the pipe split completely. Scalding steam flooded the room, extinguishing the fire in a violent hiss. The warmth vanished almost instantly. Within minutes, the air turned bitter. Ethan staggered to the wall, reaching for his toolbox, when the floor beneath him gave way slightly. His foot slipped on the wet boards. He fell hard, pain shooting up his leg. When he tried to stand, his right ankle refused to bear weight. He cursed under his breath, gripping the table to pull himself up. Grace barked sharply, running to his side. Steam still poured from the broken pipe, filling the air with fog and the smell of rust. Ethan dragged himself toward the door, grabbed an old wool blanket, and wrapped it around the shivering dogs. "It's all right," he murmured, his voice shaking from cold more than fear. "We'll be fine. We've been through worse." But when he looked around, the fire was dead, the lantern nearly out, and frost already forming on the inside of the windows. Outside, the storm thickened. Snow swept across the clearing in frantic waves, smothering the cabin in darkness. Across the valley, Henry Brooks sat by his window, staring into the white expanse. The light from the coal cabin had been visible every night since Ethan's arrival, a warm flicker between the trees. But tonight, the hillside was dark. "Martha," he called quietly. "Do you see it?" Martha, her small frame wrapped in a thick shawl, joined him at the window. Her face, pale under the lamplight, was etched with concern. "No smoke," she whispered. "Not a thing." Henry reached for his coat. "We're going." "It's the middle of a blizzard," Martha said, voice trembling, but not out of fear, out of reason. "The path will be gone." He buttoned his heavy parka, the old military one that still smelled faintly of oil and smoke. "Then we'll make a new one," he said simply. He turned to her and softened. "We can't leave them out there, not after all this." Martha hesitated only a moment before nodding. She fetched a lantern from the hook, its glass fogged from age. The flame inside flickered weakly, but she shielded it with her hand as they stepped into the storm. Snow bit at their faces immediately. The wind howled like something alive. Henry walked ahead, using an old walking stick to probe the drifts, while Martha followed close behind, holding the lantern high. Her hair, once neatly pinned, whipped free under her hat, white strands glowing in the dim light. She stumbled once, catching herself on Henry's arm. "I'm fine," she gasped. "Keep going." Henry's breath came heavy, his age fighting against the cold, but his resolve never wavered. He looked at her, his wife of 50 years, small and stubborn as ever, and felt the same pride he once did marching beside soldiers decades ago. "You always said I was too reckless," he said between breaths. "And you always proved me right," Martha shot back, a faint smile tugging her lips. Back at the cabin, Ethan had built a crude barricade of furniture against the wind that crept through the cracks. His injured leg throbbed. Grace stood guard near the puppies, her body blocking the cold air that seeped through the broken pipe. The frost on the windows spread like veins. He reached for another log, but his fingers had gone stiff. Every breath felt like ice in his lungs. He crawled closer to Grace, pulling the blanket tighter around her and the puppies. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the dim lantern light, and pressed her head against his arm. Her warmth was faint but real. "Good girl," he whispered. "You always keep fighting." He could feel himself fading, not into sleep, but into that gray border between exhaustion and surrender. Then, through the roaring wind, came a sound, distant at first, then growing clearer. A faint glimmer moved outside the window, a lantern swinging through the snow. Ethan blinked, unsure if it was real. The dogs perked up, ears twitching. A second light appeared beside the first. Then came the unmistakable crunch of boots on ice. "Ethan!" Henry's voice, muffled by the storm. "You in there?" Ethan tried to stand, but fell again, pain flashing through his leg. "Here!" he shouted hoarsely. "Inside!" Henry's shadow loomed against the window, followed by a thud as he shouldered the door. It refused at first, frozen shut by ice. He pushed harder. Martha set the lantern down and helped, her small hands beating at the latch. "Once more!" Henry barked. With a final crash, the door burst open, snow pouring in like a wave. Lantern light flooded the room, cutting through the haze. Henry rushed forward, lifting Ethan by the shoulders. "You're frozen, son," he said, wrapping his coat around him. Martha hurried to the dogs, pulling the puppies into her scarf, her hands trembling but sure. Grace, though exhausted, lifted her head and licked Martha's wrist. "Good girl," Martha whispered. "You kept them safe." Henry half-carried Ethan toward the doorway. "Let's get them out. Fire's dead, but we'll build another one at home." Outside, the storm howled in protest. Martha followed behind, the lantern swinging from her hand, its glow lighting their path like a small defiance against the dark. The snow came up to her knees, but she didn't falter. Henry guided them down the trail, his arm steady around Ethan's shoulders. For a moment, under the raging sky, the image of two old souls carrying life through the cold burned brighter than any fire. By the time they reached the Brooks farmhouse, the lantern was nearly out. Henry kicked the door open, and warmth from the hearth spilled over them. He helped Ethan to the sofa near the fire, while Martha laid the puppies on a blanket and fetched towels for Grace. The dogs huddled together, shaking but alive. Ethan leaned back, his face pale, but eyes glistening with gratitude. Henry crouched beside him, catching his breath. "You're safe now," he said simply. Ethan looked toward the dogs, then back at them. "We all are." Martha, her voice barely above a whisper, said, "That's what family does. We go back for each other." Henry nodded slowly, staring into the fire that now roared anew. "Ain't that the truth?" Outside, the storm raged on, but inside that small farmhouse, there was warmth. The kind that came not from flame, but from hearts that refused to let the cold win. The storm had ended, but the world it left behind looked changed. Softer somehow, though the ground was still blanketed in white. Morning sunlight filtered through the frosted windows of the Brooks farmhouse, turning the air gold and warm. Inside, the crackle of a steady fire filled the room. Ethan Cole sat in a wooden chair near the hearth, his right leg bandaged and propped on a small stool. The pain had dulled, leaving only stiffness, but the weight of exhaustion still hung on him. Yet for the first time in a long while, he felt peace. Martha Brooks moved quietly around the kitchen, the hem of her long wool skirt brushing the floor. Her silver hair, usually pinned tight, now fell loosely against her shoulders. She was small and quick, with kind but sharp eyes, the kind that saw through silence better than words could. She set a steaming bowl of oatmeal on the table and said, "Eat before it gets cold. Soldiers can't heal on an empty stomach." Ethan smiled faintly. "You remind me of the medics overseas." "Oh, I'm better than medics," Martha replied, pouring him tea. "They have medicine. I have stubbornness." Grace, the German shepherd, lay by the fireplace, her black and tan fur glistening under the light. Her leg, still bandaged, rested on a folded towel. The 3 puppies played on the rug nearby, their small paws slipping across the wooden floor as they chased one another in clumsy circles. Their tiny growls and squeaks filled the house with life. Martha's laughter joined the sound, light and soft. "Look at them," she said. "They've turned my quiet home into a circus." "They're good company," Ethan said, reaching down to scratch one puppy's ear. The smallest one, the one with the white patch on its chest, wobbled and climbed onto his lap, pressing its nose against his palm. He looked at it and said quietly, "You fought hard, little one. You earned your place." At the far end of the room, Henry Brooks sat in his old armchair, a flannel blanket draped over his legs, a pipe resting unlit in his hand. His weathered face glowed in the firelight, a map of lines carved by years of work and war. "I can't decide who's louder," he said, his deep voice breaking through the quiet. "The dogs or my wife?" Martha shot him a look, but smiled. "At least they listen when I talk." Henry chuckled. "Only because you feed them." Every night since the rescue, Henry had told stories, pieces of his youth, his time in Vietnam, the logging years with Ethan's father. Tonight was no different. After dinner, when the fire burned low and the wind hummed gently outside, Henry leaned back in his chair and began, "Your father and I once hauled a logging truck through this very valley in a snowstorm worse than the one we just faced. We got stuck in a drift so deep the front bumper disappeared." He didn't curse, didn't panic, just smiled and said, "We'll get through it. We always do." Ethan listened quietly, the firelight catching in his eyes. "He sounds like someone who didn't believe in quitting." "He didn't," Henry said, "and neither do you." The words struck something deep inside Ethan. He looked down at his bandaged leg, and then at Grace, who dozed beside him, one paw resting on the floor, her puppies tucked against her belly. "I didn't always feel that way," he admitted. "There was a time when I thought the fight had taken everything worth keeping." Henry nodded, his gaze steady. "War doesn't take everything, son. It just makes you forget what's left. Sometimes you need something, or someone, to remind you." As if understanding, Grace lifted her head and nudged Ethan's boot with her nose. He smiled. "Yeah, he said softly. Someone did. The days that followed were quiet, but full. Ethan's injury healed faster than expected, and though the limp remained, he began helping Henry mend the fence behind the house. The two men worked side by side in the melting snow, their breath visible in the crisp air. Henry's movements were slow but deliberate, while Ethan moved with practiced precision, his military discipline evident in every swing of the hammer. One afternoon, as they worked, they heard the sound of tires crunching over the road. A red pickup truck appeared at the end of the drive, followed by another, and then a third. The vehicle stopped, and several townsfolk stepped out, bundled in coats and gloves. At the front was Tom Weaver, a man in his 50s, with a thick beard dusted white with frost. His face was ruddy, his eyes sharp but kind. "Heard about what happened out here," he said, shaking Ethan's hand firmly. "Whole town did, actually. You saved those dogs, and Henry here nearly froze getting you back. Figured you could use a hand fixing up that cabin of yours." Ethan blinked, a little taken aback. "You don't have to." Tom waved him off. "Nonsense. Cabin's been part of this valley longer than most of us. Can't let it fall apart now." Behind him, a few others unloaded lumber, canned goods, and even a fresh sack of grain. From the doorway, Martha appeared, her hands on her hips, eyes glistening. "You see, Ethan, one good deed and you've turned my town into a small army." Tom grinned. "She's the general, too." Ethan felt something stir in his chest. Gratitude mixed with disbelief. "I didn't expect this." Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the thing about small towns," he said. "Word travels faster than weather." That night, the cabin lights glowed again across the valley. The villagers stayed until dusk, helping repair the last of the roof and leaving baskets of food behind. Grace and her pups explored the porch, while Martha handed out mugs of hot cider to everyone. Laughter and voices filled the air, echoing through the trees like music. When the last truck left and silence returned, the four of them, Ethan, Henry, Martha, and Grace, stood outside under the faint shimmer of stars. The snow had begun to melt in patches, revealing brown earth beneath. Ethan looked out over the hills, the lights of town flickering faintly in the distance. "You were right," he said, turning to Henry. "A small act really can warm an entire town." Henry's smile was slow, his voice quiet. "Maybe it was never about the act. Maybe it's about reminding people what goodness looks like." Ethan nodded. His breath hung in the air before fading into the cold. "You know," he said softly, "I've been wandering a long time, trying to figure out where I belonged. I think I know now." Henry looked at him, eyes glinting with warmth. "Then maybe the fight's finally over, son." Ethan smiled. Not the forced smile of gratitude, but the genuine kind that comes from finally finding home. Behind him, Martha called the dogs inside, her laughter drifting through the cold air. Grace barked once, tail wagging, as the puppies tumbled after her through the doorway. And as the snow continued to melt, the last traces of winter's storm faded with it, leaving behind only warmth, laughter, and the quiet heartbeat of a family that was never meant to be, yet somehow always was. By early spring, the last of the snow had melted from the fields. Patches of green began to rise timidly through the softened ground, and the pines that ringed the coal cabin dripped with morning dew. The air smelled of earth and new beginnings. The once silent clearing, buried for months under white, was alive again, birds darting through the branches and the slow sound of melting ice from the stream nearby. Ethan Cole stood on the porch, hammer in hand, tightening the final nail on a small wooden sign he'd carved himself. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms still scarred but strong. The faint limp in his right leg remained, a souvenir from that bitter winter night, yet it no longer defined him. Henry Brooks steadied the signpost while Martha stood nearby, with her hands clasped and eyes bright with pride. When Ethan finally stepped back, the three of them read the words together, etched in clean, careful lines. The Haven, a shelter for every living soul. The letters caught the light, golden against the pine background. Grace, the German shepherd, now fully healed, trotted in circles nearby, her tail slicing through the sunlight. Her 3 puppies, larger now, their coats thick and shining, chased one another across the soft grass. The smallest, the one with the white patch on its chest, paused at Ethan's boots and yipped as if asking for approval. He bent down, scooping the pup into his arms, its fur warm against his skin. "When I stopped the truck that day," he said quietly, half to himself, "I thought I was saving them. I didn't realize they were saving me." Henry, standing beside him, nodded. The old man's once weathered face looked softer in the spring light. The lines around his mouth deepened more by smiles than strain now. He wore his worn wool jacket, though the air was mild, and his grip on Martha's hand was firm. "That's how it works, son," he said. "God gives second chances. He just likes disguising them as lost causes." Martha laughed, brushing her palms against her apron. "And thank heavens you were stubborn enough to stop that truck." The 3 of them began preparing for the town gathering that afternoon. News of the Haven had spread quickly, not from Ethan, but from Henry's quiet storytelling at the general store and Martha's cheerful insistence at church. They had told everyone that the old coal cabin had become a refuge for animals and for people who needed to remember kindness. By midday, the small dirt road filled with visitors. Trucks and wagons lined the field as townsfolk came carrying baskets, tools, and even animals that needed care. Among them was Ellie Carter, a young woman in her late 20s with auburn hair tied back under a wool cap. Her green eyes shone with energy and a touch of shyness. She worked at the feed store in town and had a reputation for rescuing strays. Today, she arrived with a cardboard box tucked in her arms. Inside, a trembling kitten no bigger than her hand. "I heard this was the place for lost things," she said, smiling nervously. Ethan met her gaze and smiled back. "Then you heard right." Martha quickly swooped in, taking the kitten and wrapping it in a blanket. "Another guest for the Haven," she said. Grace barked once in greeting, and the puppies crowded around the newcomer, sniffing curiously. As the afternoon wore on, laughter and conversation filled the clearing. Henry grilled food over an open fire pit, his old hands steady as ever. Martha arranged loaves of bread and jars of jam on the porch table. Ethan moved among the people, shaking hands, accepting smiles, and answering questions about his plans. Someone suggested putting up a donation box for food and blankets. Another offered to bring spare lumber for a barn. The cabin, once silent and isolated, was now a heartbeat at the center of something larger than itself. When the sun began to dip, streaks of orange and gold painted the forest. The light caught in the branches of the tall pines where Ethan had first stopped his truck that winter night. He looked at them now, no longer haunted by that memory, but grateful for it. He walked toward the edge of the clearing, his boots sinking softly into the damp soil, and paused beneath the same pine where he had first seen Grace bound through the storm. She came to his side, pressing her head against his leg, her amber eyes calm and knowing. He knelt, resting a hand on her neck. "You found me when I didn't even know I was lost," he said. Grace wagged her tail and nuzzled closer. Behind them, Henry and Martha sat on the porch swing, hands intertwined. The years between them had turned their gestures slow but tender. Henry watched the trees sway, his voice barely above a murmur. "I used to think we'd seen all our miracles, Martha." She smiled, her gaze fixed on the sunlight filtering through the branches. "Maybe we just needed someone younger to remind us they still happen." The sound of the puppies playing drifted through the air, their barks mingling with the faint creak of the swing and the rustle of pine needles. The little kitten purred softly in Martha's lap, and even Henry laughed when it climbed his sleeve. As the evening deepened, the townsfolk began to leave, waving goodbye with promises to return. Ellie lingered last, watching as Grace herded her pups toward the porch. "You built something beautiful here," she told Ethan quietly. He looked around, at the repaired cabin, the sign gleaming on its post, the couple who had become family, and the 4 dogs that had once been half-frozen shadows in the snow. "No," he said gently. "It built itself. I just stopped long enough to see it." Ellie smiled, the kind of smile that hinted this place might hold more beginnings than endings. "You'll need help when the next storm comes," she said. Ethan nodded. "Then I guess I'd better make room." As twilight settled, the forest glowed with the soft gold of sunset. The wind stirred the chimes that Martha had hung by the porch, their clear tones drifting through the trees like a hymn. Grace barked once, her puppies answering in chorus. Ethan stood beside Henry and Martha, their shoulders brushing. The light faded slowly, leaving behind a peace deeper than silence. In the last glimmer of dusk, 8 hearts, 1 soldier, 1 couple, 4 dogs, and a small kitten beat together beneath the whispering pines. The place once known only for its loneliness had found its name at last. The haven, where the lost came not just to be rescued, but to learn how to live again. Sometimes, the greatest miracles don't arrive with thunder or light. They come quietly, in the shape of a wounded animal, a helping hand, or the courage to stop for someone in need. What happened in this story reminds us that God still works through ordinary hearts, guiding broken souls toward redemption and hope. In our busy world, we often drive past the small signs of grace He places before us. But if we slow down, if we choose kindness over convenience, we might just find our own haven. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that faith still lives in simple acts of love. Leave a comment to tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you never miss a story of hope. May God bless you and your loved ones with warmth, compassion, and the quiet miracles that make life worth living.